A special note about this presentation. Video frames may freeze periodically throughout the recorded presentation. Thank you for your patience. If you are interested in other online learning opportunities or in joining me during the next live webinar, please visit my website, www.thecomcollab.com, or email me at thecomcollab@gmail.com. Thank you. Enjoy tonight's presentation. So I'm Rebecca Beaudet. I go by Becca. I have a master's in education and I'm a board certified behavior analyst. I'm born and raised in New Hampshire. In college, I studied early childhood education and sociology, and then I went to graduate school for early childhood special education, as well as assistive technology. And after 5 years of teaching, I decided to go back and work on a graduate certificate in applied behavior analysis. I did go to school at Keene State and UNH, so never ventured far from New Hampshire. I've been an educator for 10 years, and I recently founded the Com Collab, which I'm really fortunate that all of you have been big supporters of. I'm an educational advocate. I do consider myself a lifelong learner, which is part of the reason that I love this new role so much, because I get to do research for my company, research for the families I work with, and get to just learn and collaborate with people all over the world thanks to the power of the internet. And then in my spare time, I really love to hike and be outside. All right, the objectives for today's webinar. Learners will define neurodiversity, neurodivergent, and neurotypical. Learners will compare and contrast the 3 models of disability. Learners will define neurodiversity affirming practices, and learners will identify neurodiversity affirming changes in their language, physical movements, therapeutic and educational services, and learning environments. I want this to be as interactive as possible. I do have parts throughout the presentation for all of you to put things in the chat, but you can also feel free at any time to turn your microphone back on and share an idea or ask a question. I really want you guys to get as much out of this as you can. So what is neurodiversity? This is a buzzword that is really blowing up all over social media, but it's not a new term. It was actually coined in the 1970s, and neurodiversity in its most basic definition just means that all brains are different. So there's different neurotypes. Neurodiversity is a natural difference that occurs in all of the complex systems of our brains, and it occurs not just in humans, but in all species. And any one group of people is considered neurodiverse. The neurodiversity movement is really what is getting everyone's attention to this term now. And the neurodiversity movement are views that the variation in behavior, sensory, emotional, communication, and learning styles are simply just differences and not deficits. Who make up a neurodiverse group? So there's kind of 2 categories under this umbrella of neurodiverse. So there's neurodivergent, which can be used to describe lots of different people. It's anyone that diverges from neurotypical. So this could be autistic people, ADHDers, people with traumatic brain injuries, people who have had strokes, people with fetal alcohol syndrome, people with depression and anxiety, and many more mental health diagnoses. Neurotypical is used to describe people that are not neurodivergent. So throughout this presentation, my hope is that we're going to shift the way that we think about disability. So a lot of us are first introduced to disability through this medical model. So it's looking at disability as an impairment, as a deficit. This is usually how families are first introduced to disability if their child is disabled or has a medical diagnosis. It really looks at disability through this deficits lens. And we want to move more towards the social model and the human rights model, where we look at how does the environment impact a person's learning differences or disabilities, and how can we look at disability as just part of the natural human condition, and that disabled people have access to rights just as people of different races and genders and sexual orientations. My graphic on this page was inspired by Serena and Kylie of PlaySpark. They have an amazing Neurodiversity Affirming webinar that I recommend to everybody. So how can we be more neurodiversity affirming? Today we're going to look at ways we can change our language, ways we can change our physical movements, changes in the ways that we approach therapy and educational services, and the ways we respond to behavior, and then the ways we can change the learning environment. All right, so this is the first part for everybody to participate. So you can either type in the chat, or if you want to be brave and turn your microphone back on, what are some commonly used words or phrases that may not be neurodiversity affirming? Low-level learner, Lindsay says. Yep. Defiant, non-compliant, difficult. Thanks, Kina. Yeah, so really all of these examples are putting the blame on the disabled person and looking at them with a deficits-based lens. Mallory says using words like kiddo when you're talking about an older child. Yeah, definitely. All right, so throughout my presentation, I'm going to be using language from the human rights and social model of disability. So again, the medical model that most people are first introduced to disability through really focuses on person first language. So child with autism, person with ADHD, individual with a disability. It looks at disability as an accessory. Where the social and human rights model really looks at disability as a critical part of who someone is and something that shouldn't be separated from them. So we're really removing that stigma and using identity first language. So saying autistic child, actually autistic, ADHDer, disabled person. I have a graphic on the right-hand side from the Neurodivergent Rebel. So they are an actually autistic adult, and they asked over 2,000 people who follow them on Twitter, which do you prefer? And they had the options of autistic person, person with autism, on the spectrum, and other. And 61% of the voters preferred autistic person. If you listen to autistic voices online, they are saying that they prefer this identity first language. Of course, everyone is going to have their own individual preferences, so it's always good to talk to the child or the family or the student that you're working with and see how they prefer to be labeled. But in general, when we're talking about the disabled community, we want to use that identity first language unless someone prefers otherwise. So how can we all change our language to be more neurodiversity affirming? So we just talked a little bit about identity first language. So saying disabled person, autistic individual, the community of people with an ADHD diagnosis have adopted the identity first phrase ADHDer. So that is the preference of the ADHD community. Mallory had talked about levels of functioning. So before we had all this great information from the autism community, we were using this medical-based model still and talking about people as either low or high functioning, which is really detrimental. And it's not overly helpful because someone is not good at everything or bad at everything. We need different support in different areas of our life. So we're going to change our phrasing and talk about level of support needs instead. What level of support does that individual need in communication or in social development, in math, in life skills? We're going to look at how we can change the environment to support them and talk about that level of support need. Another phrase in the medical model of disability that you might hear is nonverbal. And the autistic community has shared that they prefer non-speaking or minimally speaking. The reason being that someone might have a lot of communication and ideas to share, and they're just not using vocal speech. That doesn't mean that they don't have verbal skills. So it's just that they're not speaking or they're minimally speaking, but they still have verbal skills to share. Validate communication and feelings. There's a lot of times in our own language that we are invalidating the experience of people in the neurodivergent community. We're saying, oh, it's not that bad. Oh, it's not that hard. Just stop complaining. Just do this. We have to think about the things that we're saying. Are we validating the experience of the population that we're collaborating with? Avoiding phrases such as we are all a little autistic, or they don't seem, look, or act autistic. It's a spectrum for a reason. There's not one way to look or sound autistic. So we really are doing a lot of harm by using that phrase. And then by saying we're all a little autistic. Autism is a neurotype, and though there's neurodiversity and we're all neurodiverse, we're not all autistic. Avoid using the phrase expert in your professional title unless you, in and of yourself, are in that disability community. I know that I've made mistakes in the past talking about specializing in autism. It's like, well, I've studied it. I've talked to a lot of people in the autism community, but I'm not a specialist or an expert because I am not autistic. I don't have that lens and that lived experience to share. Remember to use strengths-based language and list all of the things that individual child, student can do. Right from that time of diagnosis, families are getting 30, 40-page reports listing out all the deficits, all of the things that their child can't do. So we really want, as professionals and supporters in that community, to really help shine a light on all the things that person can already do and what those next steps are that they're approaching. Autism is not a disease, and therefore we do not treat it. This is a tough one in the world of ABA, and I know some of the guests on the call tonight can attest to that. I mean, we write treatment plans, right? And a lot of the phrases that insurance companies want included in there talk about the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Talks about remediating symptoms of autism. It's not a cancer. It's not a disease. We don't need to remediate symptoms or treat it. So really think about that language you're using in your reports and the message that it's sending to the autism community. Presuming competence is a really big part of how we can change our language. Like when we talk in front of non-speaking or minimally speaking individuals, presuming that they still understand what's happening and have that receptive language, we want to have that respect. Using the appropriate tone of voice and vocabulary for each child's individual needs. I know Mallory touched on that a little bit. Like even if a child is still working on certain skills and they're 15 years old, you don't want to talk to them like they're 5 and, call them kiddo or use like a baby voice. And then again, that identity first language, we can say disabled, we can say disability. They're not bad words. And by all of us using them comfortably and confidently, we're helping remove that stigma. All right, another time to type in the chat. What are some of the ways that our physical interactions, our physical movements, how might those not be neurodiversity affirming? Mallory said using hand-over-hand prompting. Absolutely. Jen said teaching body language as positive or negative. Yes. Kina shared quiet hands. Nice. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, those are all great examples of how our physical movements may not be neurodiversity affirming. I think you guys hit a lot of the same ones that I have too. So how can we be more neurodiversity affirming in our physical movements and physical interactions? This is one that Mallory had touched on. Yeah, limiting the use of hand-over-hand prompting. There's certainly a time and a place where you might have to touch students or clients to help them, or if there's a safety situation. But really, this should be something that is limited in our practice so that we are respecting body autonomy and we're teaching individuals from a young age about consent and respect around their bodies. As disabled people age, sometimes they end up needing care around, personal hygiene or movement, and they're touched a lot of the time as it is. So we really want to limit any extra touching, and if we do need to physically prompt to help with a self-care routine, that we're getting that consent first. I get questions sometimes about, do you ask consent of, a young child? Of course, it's going to look a little bit different than you would ask an adult, but really not much different. When I was working with children in an ABA clinic-based setting, I would always say, I'm gonna touch your pants to help you with your diaper, like just letting them know. And they might not be able to say like, don't do that or okay, but reading those body cues and signs of distress and taking that as consent or descent. Always let the client know before you touch them. Yep, we just covered that. Be aware of physical contact such as tickling or squeezes. So a lot of younger students especially are seeking that sensory input, even some of our older clients. So we really need to be aware of when and if that's appropriate. With some kids, it's going to be, and in some settings, it's going to be. You really need to know your school or your company's policy around physical contact with clients and students. And then again, considering their age and body autonomy. Consider your body positioning when working with children. A lot of the clients we work with, especially in early intervention, they're little. they're not even to our hips sometimes. So we want to think about when we're talking to them, kneeling down and sitting in a chair next to them, sitting on the floor with them, so that our body language isn't threatening, especially in moments that the child or client might be dysregulated. We want to really present our bodies in a way that help with co-regulation. Ditching strategies such as whole body listening. I think this is what Jen was alluding to when she said, teaching that certain body language is positive or negative. There's been a whole wonderful discussion going on in the online neurodiversity community about whole body listening from the social thinking curriculum. And I've used this. I've used this as recent as 6 months ago, before I knew better. And, when we know better, we can do better. And that's my hope with these types of presentations, is that each person can take away one thing to improve their practice, whether it be, teaching or behavior therapy or even with your own children. And so whole body listening, for those that might not be familiar, teaches children how to be an active listener. And it uses visuals and this little character Larry, and it's like, you're going to sit with a calm body and quiet hands and eyes looking. And what we're hearing from neurodivergent adults is that this is not neurodiversity affirming, because not everybody sits still to listen. Some people tap their foot or click a pen or, use a sensory tool or flap their hands. Like, different people are going to need different things to be regulated and to be actively listening. It doesn't look or sound any one particular way. And when we're teaching kids this, it's really important that we explain that to kids. They already see and recognize differences between themselves and their peers. So us ignoring those differences isn't helping the kids any. They see it. So it's important for us to acknowledge it and put affirming language to it so kids can understand better and advocate for their own needs and how they learn and listen best. With our physical movements, we never want to block stimming, like self-stimulatory behaviors, unless it's deemed necessary for safety. There are, occasions when a stimming behavior is a repetitive motion that might cause tissue damage or have to do with like skin picking. Like those are things that we would want to target to decrease and give a replacement that the person could still regulate without injury. But for the most part, these behaviors are not injurious, and it's important that we allow access to the stimming behavior so that people can feel regulated. We can only connect and communicate and learn when we're in that optimal zone of regulation. So it's really important that people have access to the ways that they regulate. And then restraint and restriction of movement. This should absolutely be the last resort. If someone's in imminent danger, there's going to be, first aid and hospitalization. Otherwise, there are so many other things we can do first. And if it does ever lead to restraint, it really should be by people that are trained in proper techniques so that there aren't any injuries to the staff or the student. All right, everybody, type in the chat, what are some therapeutic or educational practices that may not be neurodiversity affirming? Standardized test. Yes, Lindsay. Jen says being quiet while in the classroom. Mallory says valuing neurotypical behavior. Krista says being still in the classroom. Mallory says valuing things such as eye contact. Yeah, those are all great examples. Changes in the way we approach therapy and educational services. Jen sent me another one. Thanks, Jen. Being expected to participate as everyone else. Yeah, good examples, everybody. So all of those examples that you listed are things we've all seen or heard in, school settings, daycares, therapy settings, maybe even in your own homes at times. I know I've done all of the things on that list. So what we want to shift our thinking to be more neurodiversity affirming is really focusing on that connection piece first. You can't get to any behavior or educational goal before you have connection. So focusing on the child's interests, getting to know the family and their backgrounds, and there's a little bit of a myth, I think, about teachers and therapists and people in the human services field about, not disclosing too much about your personal life. I think it's always a balance. Like we have to set boundaries and be professional, but leading as a human first before you talk about your title and, what you're there to help with. We're all human beings first. So making that connection with the people that we're working with, including our colleagues, because we can't make effective change and support children and students and their families if we're not teammates that are collaborating and respecting one another. So that connection piece across the board, from the child to the family to your colleagues, the administration, it's so important to have that human connection first. After the connection, communication is the next really key component. You want to make sure that you're communicating in a way that is respectful of the child, that's validating of the child, and then that extends all the way up to their families, to your colleagues, to the administration. Communication is key. And then co-regulation. This one is one I've been really excited to dive into recently in my own professional learning. It seems so obvious when I was listening to Jessie Ginsburg give her sensory speech and language training. I'm like, yes, of course. Why didn't I know this 10 years ago when I first started in the field? Like, we all have very complex sensory systems. It goes beyond just our 5 basic senses. We also have, our vestibular and interoception and proprioceptive systems. So it's this complex communication between our organs and our brain, feeling temperature and hunger and the need to use the bathroom. Like, all of these regulation pieces are so important to have those needs met so that we can connect and communicate. So I would actually even argue that if I was listing this in an order of priority, that co-regulation would maybe go before connection and communication, because if you're not in a regulated place, you're not going to be able to connect or communicate. So really valuable to educate yourself on the different sensory systems. We don't want to work out of our scope of practice. I'm not going to recommend things that an OT would, because I'm not an occupational therapist, but just having that background knowledge to know it's something to even look for. Like, does a child need different visual input? Do they need more lights or less lights? Do they need to work in an area where there's not clutter on the wall? Do they need a room with light colors or bright colors? And then doing that same kind of environment check for sight, for sound, for taste. And we're going to get into that on another slide too. But that co-regulation piece is so important, that we're helping regulate sensory systems, and then that's going to further support regulating emotion and behavior. And it's our job as the provider to really be modeling all of those strategies, because co-regulation is a prerequisite for self-regulation. And then shared enjoyment. I would say to my supervisees, if you're not having fun, they're probably not having fun. Education and therapy, it should be fun. Kids learn through play. So it's really important that it is play with very low demand, so that they're taking risks and reaching those next milestones, working on emerging skills. Think about how we can change the context to support the child. Is the way that we presented a task, is that the way it has to be presented? Can we change it up a little bit? Using accommodations, and this can look different for lots of different kids. Are we using, speech to text? Are we using audiobooks? Are we providing modified scissors? Different alternative seating? Lots of different accommodations. We really want to, again, think about each sensory system with our accommodations, creating schedules with the child and not for the child. A lot of us in our practices, we have certain content that we're required to cover from our governing bodies, whether it's the Department of Education or the Behavior Analyst Credentialing Board. There are certain things that we can and can't do, but the order, let the child help us determine the order of things. Maybe we have to teach a math lesson and we have to teach a reading lesson, but within those lessons, is there choice for the children? Can they switch the order or the format of something? Thinking about strengths-based goals. This has been a journey for me to unlearn and relearn as we speak. I know Keena and I were just talking about this the other day. It's really difficult, especially when a lot of the assessment tools that we have to use are deficits-based. So you're using a deficits-based tool and trying to create a strengths-based goal from it. It takes a lot of careful and creative thinking on our part, but it's so important that we're putting accommodations right into the goal, and we're thinking about what is the child already good at to help them reach that next level. And then the goals should really promote pride and joy and self-advocacy, self-regulation, and authentic participation. Like, if the goals are meaningless to the person we wrote them for, like, why are they even in there? And again, it takes a lot of creativity and thought on our behalf. It's a shift in thinking, but it's so important. All right, typing in the chat, what are some ways that behavior is managed that may not be neurodiversity affirming? To socialize and make friends. Planned ignoring. These are all really nice examples. Clip charts in classrooms. Conversations. Having a communication system push that doesn't work for the individual. Yes. Krista and I saw that a couple of times in our common setting we worked in. Tina agreed with that. She saw some communication systems pushed as well. All right. Thank you. Those were all good examples. You guys, you could teach this presentation. You're hitting all the key points. Oops. There we go. Changes in our responses to behavior. So, this first one I'm super passionate about. It is the mission of my business: compassion and communication over compliance, collaboration over compliance. Compliance cannot be the goal. There are times when it is completely appropriate for a child or an adult to say no or not want to do something. So that should never be our goal. Our goal is always thinking about what needs are being met or what needs are unmet. What is this individual trying to communicate with us? And then collaborating with them to solve the problem. It's not our jobs as teachers and behavior analysts and parents to always be right or to always be in charge. It really should be a collaborative process. And that's not to say that, students or children shouldn't have limits and boundaries, of course. But thinking really intentionally about which demands or limits or boundaries are actually necessary for their development, for their safety, and I'm talking physical and emotional safety. Look for precursors and offer support before the behavior escalates. And if we're really doing that connecting piece when we first start working with a child or a family, we're going to know what those precursors look like because we've talked to people that already know that child or student better than us. We really need to let parents know how much they are advocates for their child and how they really do know their child best. So if a parent or a family says, I'll notice my child clench their fist right before they start crying and flopping to the floor. Believe the family. They've seen it. Maybe we haven't. So that's a precursor we want to look at. If we see the clenched fist, instead of being reactive and responding to the child when they're already in crisis, let's support them right now. We see the clenched fist. Thinking about all of those sensory needs. Are they hungry? Are they tired? Are the lights too bright? Do they need a movement break? Did they just come back to school after being out with a cold for 3 days? Like, we really need to look at all of those components and offer support before things escalate further. And that goes with the next bullet about changing the context. What parts of the environment can we change to support that child or student? Either decreasing and sometimes increasing the sensory input. Consider communication needs. Are they trying to communicate something to us? Is their mode of communication available to them? If they're an AAC user or a textbook user, or they use like a core board, are those things within reach that they can communicate their needs? Honor communication whenever possible. Again, it's about communication and collaboration. If someone is asking for something, within reason, try to honor that. Model replacement strategies, and this is best in that precursor or even before. There's lots of moments when children and individuals are already at baseline. These are great times to practice coping strategies. We don't want to practice them when someone's already escalated. That could be viewed as punishing, or escalate somebody further because you're talking and you're getting close to them, modeling something, and they might want space or less auditory stimulus. So modeling those replacement strategies, timing's everything. You want to model them before behavior escalates. Consider the order of things. I know we talked a little bit about this on the previous slides. Like, can you teach the math lesson before the reading lesson? Can things even happen concurrently? Like, it's common in human service fields, especially behavior therapy, to use like first then schedules, which can feel really reinforcing or punishing depending on the moment and the child. You don't always have to withhold an interest to get someone to work through something that's difficult. Can you offer the things simultaneously? If brushing teeth is really difficult and the child likes watching Elmo, can they watch Elmo while they're brushing their teeth instead of saying, oh, you have to brush your teeth and then you get Elmo? Can you offer them at the same time? Consider those bodily needs. So, are they hungry, thirsty, tired? Do they need the bathroom? Do they need to move around and have a stretching break? We can ignore the behavior without ignoring the person. This is a really hard skill to hone in on. What I mean by ignoring the behavior but not the person. If someone is swearing, for example, an older student is swearing at you, of course that's not ideal. And I think Keena and I talked about this the other day. Like, if a student curses at you to leave them alone, you actually do know what they're asking. They want to be left alone. They need a break. You can honor that they're asking for space without acknowledging the swearing. So you could be like, oh, it sounds like you need space right now. And then you give them the space. So you're ignoring the swearing behavior, but you're not ignoring the person and the needs that they're communicating. And then that heavy reliance on external motivators or rewards. And I'm not talking the occasional, high five or candy bar at the grocery store. We're all going to reinforce kids. We're going to reinforce ourselves. But we want to think about how often we're using this, because we don't want to start dampening somebody's internal motivation. We don't want to start unnecessary competition between peers, and we don't want to take away the fun and spontaneity out of learning. There's a lot of reasons here, and I have a whole video on this that I did with Meg Thompson. So if you want to know more about using external motivators and rewards and the possible pitfalls with that, I would encourage you to check out that video. Okay, let's see. Jen says dim the lighting, different seating options. Mallory says access to sensory input and breaks. Yes, yes, yes. Honestly, this is my new favorite topic on here. Being open if a student needs to stand up, walk around at some point. STEM, yes. Giving ability to move around or go outside, absolutely. All right. I know there's a lot of text on this one. I really got excited. As I mentioned earlier, I recently did a course with Jessie Ginsburg. She does speech and language therapy in California, but she took a sensory course, and she was one of the first sensory certified speech and language pathologist, and now she trains other SLPs how to use sensory in their sessions so that kids can be regulated in order to be able to connect and communicate. So she really got me thinking pretty differently about all the sensory systems and all of the ways that too much or too little sensory input can really contribute to dysregulation and therefore put someone out of the optimal zone for learning. So these are all areas we can look at adjusting the level of sensory input. So someone might be hypersensitive to something where even the littlest bit of input feels like a lot. And then someone might be hyposensitive where you can give a lot and a lot and a lot, and they're seeking it because they're not feeling that input or hearing that input as easily as somebody else might be. So when we think about adjustments to the visual learning environment, we can think about lighting, the colors in the room. And I have a couple classroom pictures here. Like that top classroom has a lot of bright colors on the wall, whereas the classroom on the right has more like natural lighting and natural shades. So depending on the age and the population of students, you might have different color palettes, different shapes and patterns, pictures and written schedules, object schedules. All of your organized bins in your classroom or therapy space could have picture labels, maybe one wall being blank for children that need less visual input when they're working or doing therapy goals. Folding or cutting worksheets into sections, so kids are only seeing part of their worksheet at a time for visual chunking, visual organizers for writing, visual modeling, putting dividers so they could sit in like a little cubby space while they're working if that's preferred to them to block out some of the visual clutter. For young kids or kids that really like visual stims, toys with lights, high contrast books, using gesture and sign language paired with your vocal presentations. And then if you're working on like a PowerPoint or something, you could have an option for closed captions. That can be helpful for people. For auditory learning environment changes, thinking about using music, offering noise-canceling headphones, singing, putting tennis balls on chairs so that the scraping of the chairs doesn't bother someone that might be sensitive to that sound, toys with sounds, musical instruments, nature sound machines and apps, and text-to-speech accommodations. All right, for tactile, having different textures within the room, sensory bins, carpets, bumpy cushions, using tickles, feathers. I had one student that didn't like to touch different like art projects and sensory projects, but he liked to do them. So offering that someone wear gloves so they can still participate in the activity, but not have to have different textures on their hands. Vibrating toys. For olfactory, so that's your sense of smell. You could have scented plugins or sprays, scented lotions, lavender bean bags. You can put cinnamon in your Play-Doh, like homemade Play-Doh mixes. You could have a mint plant in your classroom, sitting by the window for fresh air, walking on a nature trail for outdoor scents. Gustatory, so this is your sense of taste. Provide a menu of preferred snacks or meals, have different spices and sauces. There was a mom on one of the groups that I was following that said her child has a hypersensitive gustatory sense, so they like are seeking flavors all the time. So she brings like little travel spices and travel sauces everywhere with her to add to his food. Let's see. What else we have? Offering gum or mints, chewable toys, chewable jewelry, adding lemon or orange slices to somebody's water, letting the child help cook and taste test. And then these are the three other sensory systems that I just recently learned about, and it really does impact somebody's ability to regulate and participate. The interoception, so that internal body awareness, this is like how we respond to temperature, pain, thirst, hunger, feelings of tiredness or exhaustion. So to support kids that might have hyper or hypo sensitivities to interoception, we want to think about like scheduling bathroom breaks or having free access to the bathroom. For some kids, having to ask or get a hall pass, that's going to be really challenging if they can't really feel that they need to use the bathroom until it's an emergency. So thinking about having like flexibility around the bathroom. And then for kids that might need those reminders, having scheduled times, scheduled snack or meal times, as well as flexible snack or meal times. Treating injuries as serious. There's always that one kid that goes to the nurse all the time and we don't think that they're injured, but if they have a different interoception system, they might feel more injured more often. So we want to take those things serious because they feel serious to the child. Proprioception, that external body awareness, so offering things like deep pressure, heavy work or chores, supervised climbing and jumping, wheelbarrow walks, wall push-ups, tug of war. And then for vestibular, this is your ability to balance and know where your body is in space. So swinging back and forth, spinning, wiggle seats and wobble stools, rocking chairs, bouncing on a yoga ball, hopping on those little floor dots, balancing on beams or stepping stones, holding hands on the stairs. This one was eye-opening to me, that if someone has a difference in their vestibular sensory system, it's why you might see kids be really nervous on stairs. So it's like this feeling of not kind of trusting or understanding gravity. So stairs can be really scary, which is why a lot of kids on the autism spectrum might want to hold your hand on stairs, even when they're maybe too old to hold hands. And I put that in quotes because that's silly. If someone needs to feel safe and hold your hand, I think that's okay. Using a footstool if their feet don't touch the ground. Again, that sense of like, ooh, I'm a little nervous, I'm not touching the ground. All right, so we've talked about all these ways that we can change our own actions and behaviors, whether it be through our language, through our physical movements, through our own approaches, through the environment. But how do we talk to children and students about this, whether it be kids in our class, kids on our caseload, maybe our own kids at home? These topics are complex, even for adults to talk about and unlearn and relearn. So how do we have these conversations with kids so that we are supporting all of the children and students in our life, but also helping the next generation have more healthy conversations around neurodiversity and disability? I personally love using books to do this. That way you don't have to reinvent the wheel or feel like you're stumbling. The book kind of creates a nice script for you, and a lot of kids enjoy either listening to books or reading books to an adult. So I just created a list here, and it's based off of, there's a website called And Next Comes L. So most of the images on this slide are from her book list of Neurodiversity Affirming book recommendations, and she did a really nice job. She's read all of these books, cover to cover, and she summarizes them on her blog post, like what makes this a neurodiversity affirming book, if there are any red flags in any of the books, like she mentions those, and then she also has a list of books to avoid, and she tells you why. Like maybe it uses talk of curing autism or something that's the opposite of neurodiversity affirming. She really does a nice job explaining that and the pros and cons. So there's a lot of great books out there. The Case of Sensational Stims, that's a brand new one, written by two neurodivergent adults, or written and illustrated by two neurodivergent adults, and they do a really nice job describing like what stimming is in a really positive way. And I'm super excited because I get to talk to to both of them in May. We're going to be doing a YouTube Live talking about their book, so I'm super excited for that. Printable social stories. There's a lot of really great social stories on Neuroclassic's website that talk about different communication styles, that talk about different ways people regulate and learn. So those are all really good ways to start talking about neurodiversity to children. A lot of the resources on this slide in particular are good for young children, but there are some nice resources for a little bit older kids or older students. I know that Passport Speech, she has a page on Teachers Pay Teachers, and she has some great infographics and presentations that you can use with older students or even with families that talk about neurotypical and neurodivergent communication styles and body language. So those are some great resources to get those conversations started. So in all of these neurodiversity affirming shifts that we can make, it's important that we all are part of harm reduction. So it's all of our responsibilities. Whatever field we work in, education, therapy, behavior analysis, it's important that we know the history of our fields and the history from the population we serve, the histories from their perspectives. We're seeking to improve lives in different populations, so it's really important to know from those populations, are we actually improving lives? And if we're not, being able to let down our walls and our defenses and really hearing that and reflecting and seeing how we can change. And I know that takes a lot of courage. It's hard to let your walls down. I know when I first dived into the neurodiversity affirming movement, it was through Instagram. There are so many great content creators talking about disability and autism and neurodiversity. And I was seeing a lot of posts about the harms of ABA, and I was fairly new in the field, and I was, in school to be a BCBA, and my first instinct was to be defensive. And no, the people I work with don't do that. The clinic I work in doesn't do that. No, that's not why I'm going to school to do this. And I was defensive, and I didn't let down my wall and try to learn something new. I was kind of in my own echo chamber of working with people that all kind of believed in the science and didn't think it could be harmful. And when you really start listening to the individuals that you serve, you start to get a different perspective of, okay, yeah, I actually can see how touching someone's body repeatedly can be disrespectful and can be dangerous. Start to see how the way I was presenting certain stimuli or setting up the environment wasn't useful to that learner. So, it took some time. I was defensive at first and thought, I couldn't possibly be harming anyone. It takes a lot to admit that you've done something that wasn't the best practice, especially when you just learned the opposite thing in your college courses or the training you went to, and you spend a lot of time and money honing in on your craft. So to learn that what you were taught is supposed to support someone is doing the opposite, it can be really jarring. But it's very important that we're all doing that reflection and really listening to diverse voices, taking ourselves and making sure we're not just in an echo chamber hearing our own opinion echoed back to us. Amplifying neurodivergent voices and voices of other marginalized groups. So if you are working with the autistic community, follow autistic creators. Want to learn more? Follow some of my favorite neurodiversity affirming practitioners. Meg Proctor at Learn, Play, Thrive, Katya at Boho Speechy, McAllister at The Neurodivergent Teacher, Kat and Katrina at Bridges Learning Systems, Rachel Coley at Can Do Kiddo, Serena and Kylie at PlaySpark, Meg Thompson at Meg Thompson Behavior, Robin at Teach Official, Jesse at jessieginsburg.slp, and Cassie at Kind Connections. If you would like to learn more about online learning opportunities or other services that I provide, please consider contacting me at my website, www.thecomcollab.com, at _com_collab on Instagram, Rebecca Beaudet on Facebook, thecomcollab@gmail.com by email, or check out my YouTube channel, The Com Collab. Thank you so much. I look forward to collaborating soon.